When we last left off, Crimea had, following the events of World War I and the Russian Civil War, been recaptured by Soviet forces. If you missed part 1, click the card above me, or see the link in the description down below. Also, if you would like to learn more about the Russian Civil War and 2 other ghost countries that emerged in the chaos, check out our episode about Green Ukraine and the Far Eastern Republic. And with that out of the way, let's get back to it. During World War II, the peninsula was captured by Axis forces during the 8-month Crimean campaign, which ended following the surrender of Sevastopol on July 4, 1942. Crimea thereafter came under de facto German control and was incorporated into the Reichskommissariat Ukraine as Teilbezirk Taurien. How was that pronunciation, guys? Pretty spot on, right? Couldn't even tell I'm not from Germany? Anyway, it remained as such until it was retaken by Soviet forces in May 1944. In what later was described as a form of collective punishment for the alleged collaboration of Crimean Tatars with Germany, Soviet officials began a state-sanctioned campaign of detatarization, which saw at least 191,044 people forcibly deported to Central Asia, while an estimated 45,000 died in exile. This dramatically changed the peninsula's demographic makeup, with Crimean Tatars who had made up about 20% of the population in 1939, by 1979 accounting for less than 1%. Crimea then became an oblast or province of the Russian SFSR on June 30, 1945, before eventually being transferred to the Ukrainian Socialist Soviet Republic in 1954 on the basis of the integral character of the economy, the territorial proximity, and the close economic and cultural ties between the Crimea province and Ukrainian SSR. And there it remained, even after the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. Just prior to this, the Supreme Soviet of the Ukrainian SSR changed the status of Crimea from an oblast to an autonomous republic following a state-sanctioned referendum held in January 1991. 4 months later, necessary changes were made to the Ukrainian SSR's constitution, and in September, the Crimean parliament declared the territory a sovereign, constituent part of Ukraine. Thereafter, the peninsula officially became the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, itself part of the newly independent Ukraine. In 1992, however, the Crimean parliament changed its name to the Republic of Crimea, putting forward a new constitution that declared the republic an independent state. Oh, and a little bit off topic here, but let's talk about Crimea's flag. The triband you see on screen now was adopted in September 1992. However, there were at least 5 other proposals submitted to the Crimean parliament, along with a commonly used public design somewhat reminiscent of the flag of Cyprus. The current flag being a modified version of proposal number 5, which was readopted in 1999 and again in 2014. That May, Ukraine's parliament annulled the constitution and, what's more, demanded the government of Crimea put a stop to a planned referendum on independence. Both sides reached a compromise in June, with Crimea again being designated as an autonomous republic, receiving special economic status in exchange for reaffirming it being an integral part of Ukraine in a revised constitution adopted that September. Just a couple of years later, though, Crimea's parliament created a new office, President of Crimea, and in February 1994, Yuri Meshkov, a politician who supported much closer ties with Russia, including possible reunification, was elected as the Crimea's one and only president with 72.9% of the vote. Meshkov, among other things, reinstated the framework of the controversial 1992 constitution, pushed for adoption of the Russian ruble, the issuing of Russian passports, and even went so far as to change the Crimea's time zone to the same as Moscow. That being said, in 1995, the Ukrainian government abolished Meshkov's post as it contradicted the constitution of Ukraine, and special forces entered his residence. Shortly thereafter, he was put on a plane and deported to Russia. Ukraine then governed Crimea directly until a new constitution was put forth and, following significant amendments, ratified in late 1998. The Treaty on Friendship, Cooperation, and Partnership between Ukraine and the Russian Federation had also just been signed the previous year, in which Moscow recognized Ukraine's existing borders and sovereignty over Crimea. What's more, Ukraine agreed to lease facilities in Sevastopol to Russia's Black Sea Fleet until 2017. In 2006, though, tensions flared up again as anti-NATO protests broke out across the peninsula in response to planned military exercises with the United States. This was followed by accusations in 2008 from Ukraine's foreign ministry that Moscow was providing Russian passports to the population of Crimea as casus belli for a possible armed intervention. More protests in Crimea occurred the following year as members of the Russian bloc, a political party that alongside the similarly pro-Russian Party of Regions made up the majority of Crimea's parliament, voiced their desire for intervention like that which had occurred in Georgia concerning Abkhazia and South Ossetia. In 2010, Ukraine agreed to extend Russia's lease of naval facilities in Crimea until 2042 with optional 5-year renewals, but that didn't really matter because things hit the fan in 2014. In the decades following its independence, Ukraine had become ever more divided between a nominally pro-Western center and west versus a more pro-Russian east and south. These are generalizations, of course, but perhaps nothing better showcased these socio-political fault lines than the election of Viktor Yanukovych in 2010. As the fourth president of Ukraine and hailing from the Donbas region, Yanukovych is perhaps best remembered for his rejection of a free trade and association agreement with the EU in favor of pursuing closer ties with Moscow. This, among other things, sparked massive demonstrations later known as Euromaidan, which eventually resulted in his ouster during the previously mentioned 2014 revolution. For many in Ukraine's east and south, where Yanukovych enjoyed strong political support, this would not be tolerated, giving rise to a series of pro-Russian anti-government counter-demonstrations, sometimes called the Russian Spring, that February. Later that same month, reports of little green men began to filter in, but as far back as February 4th, the Crimean parliament had already considered holding a referendum on the peninsula's status, having asked the Russian government if it would guarantee the vote. Sevastopol's city council had also begun to call for the organization of so-called people's militias to defend against extremism. An extraordinary meeting of parliament was called on February 21st, which seemed open to an agreement between Yanukovych and Euromaidan protesters then being discussed. Pro-Euromaidan demonstrations occurred in Simferopol, while pro-Russian demonstrators took to the streets of Sevastopol. The situation quickly deteriorated, with fights breaking out between both sides, and a request was made by the Ukrainian government for the United Nations to monitor the situation in Crimea. It's likely that around this time, Russian troops had already entered the Crimean Peninsula, as they soon occupied the Crimean Parliament building in Simferopol. Barricades were then raised, as was the Russian flag, while in Parliament, an emergency session voted to disband the current government, replacing the acting prime minister with Sergei Aksyonov of the Russian Unity Party. This contradicted Ukraine's constitution. However, Aksyonov and others would later justify these actions, as they still viewed Yanukovych as the country's de jure president, not the newly established interim government. A referendum was also planned for March 25th regarding Crimean self-autonomy. Within hours, Ukraine was effectively cut off from the peninsula, and then, on March 11th, Crimea's parliament, alongside the city council of Sevastopol, jointly declared themselves to be an independent, self-governing entity. The date of the referendum was also moved to March 16th, and its scope changed to asking whether Crimea should integrate with Russia or restore the 1992 constitution. Despite being deemed unconstitutional by the Constitutional Court of Ukraine, the referendum went ahead with a reported 97% having voted in favor of joining Russia. On March 17th, just a day after the referendum, the Republic of Crimea was formally declared, consisting of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol, which was given special status within the breakaway republic. Russia immediately recognized Crimea as a sovereign state, and the following day its representatives signed off on a treaty of accession, which was deemed to be in compliance with Russia's constitution and ratified on March 21st. As a result of its annexation of Crimea, Russia was suspended from the Group of Eight, and international sanctions were imposed on Moscow, contributing to a collapse of the ruble and a financial crisis. By mid-2018, Russia had lost an estimated $170 billion due to sanctions, with another $400 billion in lost revenue owing to the 2010s oil glut. Ukraine, of course, has continued to voice its opposition to Russian actions in Crimea, describing the peninsula as one of 3 temporarily occupied territories. In particular, Kiev claims that Russia's annexation of Crimea is a violation of international law and its territorial integrity as guaranteed in the Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurances, which saw Ukraine give up its nuclear stockpile, then the world's 3rd largest. Admittedly, most of this was non-operational as its, operating capabilities were tied into that of the Soviet Union. Russian President Vladimir Putin pushed back, arguing it had never been under obligation to force any part of Ukraine's civilian population to stay in Ukraine against its will. Moreover, Russia suggested the US was actually in violation of the Budapest Memorandum, describing the 2014 revolution as an American-instigated coup. A small number of countries have recognized the referendum itself and/or expressed their support for it. This includes both UN member states and those that are not. What exactly happens next is, hard to say. There are allegations that the referendum in Crimea was anything but free and fair. And to be sure, Kiev has not given up trying to reincorporate Crimea, along with the other temporarily occupied territories, back into Ukraine. Russia, however, does exercise de facto control over the peninsula, and the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, alongside that of Sevastopol, currently make up the 84th and 85th federal subjects of Russia. So, Crimea's story may not be over yet, but we'll just have to wait and see.